In today's lesson, we will be examining the political spectrum, the idea of ideology, and their application to the study of geopolitical events and world issues. These terms are ones that we use often when identifying and analyzing the response to many complex issues, so it's important that we understand them and know how to use them effectively. And in today's lesson, we will be trying to answer the following questions. What is the political spectrum? How are ideas organized on the political spectrum? What is ideology? How does the political spectrum change over time? And is the political spectrum linear? So to start off with, here is a definition for the political spectrum. The political spectrum is a tool used by political scientists to classify political positions in relationship to each other. And the political spectrum is divided into a left wing and a right wing. There's nothing special about this terminology. There's a historical origin of it. It emerged first during the French Revolution, and all that happened was the more radical revolutionaries, they sat on the left side of the assembly, and the more conservative thinkers sat on the right side. So this is where this terminology of left-wingers versus right-wingers first emerged, and it's kind of just stuck around since then. And positions we can then classify as being either right or left of one another. And again, these ideas exist along a spectrum. It's not that there's some kind of duality going on here. There's a spectrum with plenty of points in between. And so your political opinion on a political issue can be explained in relation to other possible views based on the political spectrum. So for example, let's look at the idea of taxation. People on the far left of the political spectrum might want very high taxes on the rich in order to eliminate the income gap entirely. More moderate thinkers on the left wing might be in favor of higher taxes on the rich to reduce the income gap. People on the center of the political spectrum would acknowledge that we need some taxes to pay for a variety of public services. Those on the moderate right wing might favor lower taxes to pay for basic public services. And someone on the far right wing might want to eliminate all taxes altogether. And this chart kind of just takes this idea a step further. So this chart's showing the differences in perspectives along the political spectrum. So people on the left tend to support changes that improve the welfare of all citizens. They believe that government should play a large role in instituting changes in society, and they believe that law and order are important to protect the rights of all citizens and society as a whole. On the center of the political spectrum, tradition is viewed as important, but there's a belief that change must be made if the majority want it. They believe that government should only play a role in people's lives when it improves their lives in a tangible way, and compromise is the most noble means of governance. On the right wing, tradition is often highly valued. It's thought of as very important, and change should be treated with caution. Right-wingers often say that the government should play only a small role in society, and businesses and private individuals, on the other hand, should provide most services to people. And law and order are necessary to reinforce society's traditions. So with that in mind, let's have a look at what the political spectrum looks like in Canada as it exists today in 2017. So those on the left might be in favor of raising taxes, or at least keeping taxes at the status quo. Whereas those on the right would be more likely to be in favor of lowering taxes, usually across the board, but especially on corporations. Those on the left are more comfortable with more government, whereas those on the right want less government intervention. Those on the left believe that we should be providing better social programs to people. The government should be doing this. So things like healthcare, education, and welfare. Whereas those on the right are more likely to favor a pay-as-you-go style of deliverance. Those on the left tend to favor individual rights. Whereas those on the right also tend to, again, respect the rights of individuals, but there again is this adherence to tradition. Now this is one where, depending on where you fall in the political spectrum, the more you get to extremes, the more blurry the line gets between the two. You'll have left-wingers who are strongly in favor of individual rights, and you'll have right-wingers who have the same position, and vice versa. Those on the left are very concerned about the rights of the vulnerable. whereas those on the right tend to be more concerned about the rights of big business. And the idea on the right here would be that by making businesses more profitable, they'll be able to provide to all people more effectively. Those on the left would argue that we shouldn't be doing that. We should be focusing on those who are in need before we focus on those who are already well off. The left wing tends to be more change focused, whereas the right wing wants to preserve tradition. Those on the left believe in equality of life, whereas the right wing philosophy would be equality of opportunity. The left wing tends to concern themselves more with environmental issues, whereas those on the right tend to favor economic concerns over the environment in many cases. In terms of the justice system, left-wing thinkers tend to believe in softer justice, so they would prefer us to deal with the root cause of problems. Whereas those on the right tend to favor stricter justice, so harsher penalties for criminals. You deal with the consequences of their actions. Now, with all of that in mind, let's turn our attention to a related concept, ideology. Now, whereas right versus left classifies beliefs, ideology is a kind of belief system or philosophy. An ideology is a set of opinions or beliefs of a group or an individual. Very often, ideology refers to a set of political beliefs or a set of ideas that characterize a particular culture. And this chart here shows different ideologies along the political spectrum. And by no means is this an exhaustive list. There are plenty of other ideologies that we could identify. But this is a general overview of how that looks along the left wing to the right wing of the political spectrum. So starting on the left wing, the more radical ideas, you have an ideology like communism. So these people on the radical left want quick and drastic change, and they're willing to use illegal methods if necessary. Marxism, for example, advocates a violent overthrow of the government if that's what's necessary to institute these ideas. They look forward to a utopia. Marxism and communism in general is a very utopian vision of the future where there are no classes and society is equal and everything's better. Individual welfare is a priority over individual freedom. So again, here comes this idea where you're taking away people's individual freedoms in order for society as a whole to benefit. The idea is that if we all chip in, everyone can live a better life. Equal share and benefit for everybody, no private ownership of property, and equality of condition. At the end of the day, everyone has the same access to the same resources. Everyone ends up with the same outcome, no matter who you are. More moderate left-wing ideologies, so ones like social democracy, this would be closely aligned with what we know as the NDP in Canada, as well as reform liberalism, so sort of in with the Liberal Party in Canada. So they would want substantial change, but want to use existing social and political institutions to do it. So they're not advocating violent overthrow of the government. They want to use democratic or the traditions of the political system to achieve these goals. They support the ideal of individual freedom, but want to create a strong state to ensure equality of opportunity. So again, you might have some people who are winners and some people who are losers, but at the end of the day, everyone, regardless of race, class, or gender, should have the same starting point, the same opportunity to achieve. And there is some private ownership, but the government owns or heavily regulates key services. So things like hospitals, schools, possibly banks or financial institutions, etc. Moving on to the right wing of the political spectrum, this is where we get into some more conservative ideas. One that the Conservative Party of Canada, for example, might identify with. This is where we get into ideologies like classical liberalism. This is a little bit confusing, but classical liberalism is actually more aligned with what we would consider conservatism today. This is an ideology that believes in free markets. Think of people like Adam Smith, going back to those people. Classical liberalism is a lot more aligned with what we would call libertarianism today, than it is with like the Liberal Party or this idea of how we use the word liberal in terms of the left and right wing of the political spectrum. So conservatives want change that is moderate and slow, using existing institutions whenever possible. Private ownership is encouraged and regulation is discouraged. Again, there's this reliance on the idea of free markets, and the free market will solve things. If we put an idea out there, we should have competition, and the best idea will win out. And in this philosophy, equality of right is emphasized over all else. We're not going to change. We want to have winners and losers, and it's an equality of your right to be able to access that's preserved. And on the far right, this is when we get into some reactionary conservatives, as well as ideologies like fascism, as well as some emerging ideologies. You might want to consider, for example, the alt-right movement in this category. So on the far right, there's a strong opposition to change. Strength comes from the past, often an idealized or mythological version of the past. This was especially prominent when we look at the nationalist movements of the 1920s and 30s. So think like Mussolini in Italy or Hitler in Germany. Both drew upon a mythical version of the past. So Mussolini, for example, drawing upon Roman traditions and talking about making Italy a great country again. And evoking this past and tradition and saying we can get back to that tradition if only we follow my beliefs. On the far right, use of violence can be used to achieve goals, and in fact, in fascism, violence is often idealized. Authority is centered in a leader, often a charismatic leader, and the welfare of the state is prioritized more than the individual. In these far-right movements, hierarchy is seen as natural. So things like racism and chauvinism are seen as a natural part of the world. So we can see here, these ideologies, we can kind of take what we see in the news, we can take what we see in history, and we can try to identify sort of where these ideas are coming from. What's the philosophical underpinning of these ideas using ideology? Now, with that in mind, it's still important to note that the political spectrum can shift over time. The political spectrum is dependent on one's place and time. So, for example, if you were living in the U.S. South in the early 1800s, the position that African Americans should remain slaves would have been considered a moderate or centrist position. This is because this position was in line with the way society operated at the time. It was not controversial to most people. The idea that slaves should be freed would have been considered a far left idea. It was a radical change to society and to how society and the economy and the social order operated. However, if you fast forward to today, in Canada, almost any overtly racist proposal would come from the far right of the political spectrum and would not be taken seriously by the majority of Canadians, would not have a lot of support. So we can see here, depending on where you are and at what time period you're living in, your belief system might be categorized differently. And it's also important to note that many political scientists would argue that the political spectrum is not linear. It doesn't run a straight line from a far left to a far right. So one idea that was particularly popular in American academic circles during the Cold War was the idea that's being shown in this diagram here. The idea that even though fascism and communism are on opposite ends of the political spectrum, they have far more in common with each other than with the more moderate versions, the more moderate people on their wing of the political spectrum. So the idea that communists have more in common with fascists than communists do with the Liberal Party of Canada, or that fascists do with the Conservative Party of Canada. So this is this idea of totalitarianism, that when you get to the extremes of the political spectrum, it starts to curve in, and they start to have more in common with the opposite extreme than with more centrist positions. And another common way of organizing the political spectrum is to imagine it along a dual spectrum. So this one here is looking at economic freedom and personal freedom, or you can also think of it as social and financially, how do you view the world? And as a result, you can end up with different ideologies. So if you are in favor of lots of personal freedom, but not a lot of economic freedom, this would be seen as a sort of a traditional leftist position. So thinking kind of along like socialist lines or social democratic lines. If you're in favor of lots of economic freedom, but not a lot of personal freedom, this is more along the lines of sort of a traditional right-wing approach to society. Lots of personal freedom and lots of economic freedom is what we would consider libertarian today. This idea that the government should not get involved in your business unless you're infringing on the rights of another. And low economic freedom and low personal freedom would be what we might consider populism or possibly totalitarianism. And so in summary, in this lesson you learned that the political spectrum is a tool used to classify ideas and opinions in relation to one another. The political spectrum is divided into a right wing and a left wing. Ideologies are groups of beliefs which in turn can be categorized on the left-right spectrum. The political spectrum is dynamic. It can shift over time. And the political spectrum is not always linear.